Hello there, fellow travelers through time, and welcome to another peaceful journey into the hidden corners of history. I'm so grateful you've chosen to join me tonight as we explore one of humanity's most complex and misunderstood chapters, the true nature of medieval justice and the role of torture in shaping society. Before we begin our careful exploration of this difficult but important topic, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please drop a comment and let me know what draws you to these deeper historical questions. And if you find comfort in these educational journeys through time, that subscribe button helps us create more thoughtful adventures into history's hidden truths. You think medieval torture was just about punishment? Think again. Tonight, we're going to uncover the hidden truths behind these brutal practices and see if justice really played a role, or if something far more complex was driving these dark chapters of human history. Popular culture has given us images of medieval torture as random cruelty or simple punishment for crimes. But the reality was far more intricate, disturbing, and revealing about the nature of power, fear, and control in medieval society. These weren't just brutal punishments. They were carefully orchestrated systems designed to extract confessions, maintain social order, and project the absolute authority of rulers who governed through terror as much as law. So let the stresses of the modern world fade away as we step carefully into the shadows of medieval justice systems, where the line between law and brutality was often invisible, and where understanding the true purposes behind these practices reveals uncomfortable truths about power that echo through history to our own time. Tonight, we'll walk the stone corridors of medieval courts, witness the careful procedures that govern these dark practices, and discover that the hidden truth about medieval torture is more complex and more chilling than simple cruelty. To understand medieval torture, we must first understand the world that created it. Picture yourself in 13th century Europe, where the very concept of justice was fundamentally different from our modern understanding. This was a world where divine authority flowed through earthly rulers, where confession was considered the highest form of truth, and where the body itself was seen as a pathway to the soul. Let me introduce you to Brother Benedict, a learned monk serving as a legal advisor in the court of King Louis IX of France in 1254. As dawn breaks over the stone walls of the royal castle, Benedict carefully prepares the documents that will guide today's proceedings. Unlike the Hollywood image of random brutality, medieval torture was governed by strict rules, detailed procedures, and careful documentation. Benedict understands something that modern minds struggle to grasp. In medieval thinking, torture wasn't primarily about punishment, it was about truth. In a world without modern forensic science, without photographs or DNA evidence, the confession was considered the most reliable form of proof. And if someone wouldn't confess voluntarily, well, there were ways to encourage them toward what authorities believed was inevitable honesty. The medieval legal mind operated on several key principles that seem foreign to us today. First, they believed that physical pain could purify the soul and force out deception. Second, they held that an innocent person, protected by God's grace, would either be strengthened to resist the pain or would be miraculously delivered from it. Third, they saw the body and soul as so connected that physical duress would inevitably reveal spiritual truth. Brother Benedict walks through the castle's lower chambers, where the tools of judicial inquiry are kept with the same care as the sacred vessels in the chapel above. Each implement has its purpose, each procedure its proper place in the careful ritual of truth-seeking. The rack, the thumbscrews, the Iron Maiden, these weren't instruments of random sadism, but carefully designed tools in what medieval minds considered a sacred process of revealing hidden truth. In the court records that Benedict maintains so meticulously, we see the bureaucratic nature of medieval torture. Every session was documented. The accused's words were recorded. The duration and intensity of each procedure was noted. Physicians were often present to ensure the subject remained conscious and capable of confession. This wasn't chaos. It was a terrifyingly organized system. The legal scholars of the time, men like Benedict, genuinely believed they were serving justice. They had inherited from Roman law the principle that torture was a legitimate means of judicial inquiry, particularly for slaves and non-citizens. Medieval Christianity added its own layer, viewing physical suffering as a potential path to spiritual revelation. The combination created a perfect storm of sanctified brutality. As morning light filters through the narrow windows of the castle's judicial chambers, Benedict reviews the cases for today's proceedings. A merchant accused of heresy who maintains his innocence despite mounting evidence. A peasant woman suspected of witchcraft, whose neighbors have provided detailed testimony about her alleged supernatural activities. A nobleman's servant accused of theft, whose guilt seems obvious to all except himself. Each case follows the same careful progression. First, examination of the evidence. Then, opportunity for voluntary confession. If the accused maintains innocence, consultation of legal texts to determine the appropriate level of judicial pressure. Finally, the systematic application of physical persuasion documented at every step until the truth, as medieval minds understood it, was revealed. Benedict's world operated on the assumption that truth was singular and discoverable, that God's justice would ultimately prevail, and that the temporary suffering of the guilty was a small price to pay for the larger harmony of Christian society. These weren't evil men, necessarily, but men whose understanding of justice was shaped by fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, divine will, and social order. The architecture of fear extended beyond the torture chamber itself. Medieval towns were designed to display power and maintain order. Public executions, often preceded by torture, were community events that reinforced social hierarchies and reminded everyone of the consequences of challenging authority. The sight of the gallows, the stocks, the pillory, these were everyday reminders that justice was swift, brutal, and absolute. In Brother Benedict's carefully ordered world, torture served multiple purposes that extended far beyond the individual case. It demonstrated the power of the church and crown to penetrate the deepest secrets of the human heart. It provided dramatic public theater that reinforced social bonds through shared witnessing of divine justice. It created a psychology of fear that made actual enforcement less necessary. The mere possibility of torture often encouraged voluntary confession and compliance. The medieval mind also believed in graduated responses to resistance. A first refusal to confess might result in being shown the instruments of torture, with detailed explanations of their use. A second refusal might involve being stripped and bound, but not yet subjected to pain. Only persistent denial in the face of mounting pressure would result in the actual application of physical force, and even then, according to strict protocols designed to preserve life while breaking will. As the morning progresses in Brother Benedict's orderly world, we see how completely torture was integrated into the fabric of medieval justice. It wasn't an aberration or corruption of the system. It was the system, functioning exactly as designed by men who believed they were doing God's work in the most methodical and careful way possible. Now let us follow Brother Benedict as he descends to the chambers where judicial truth-seeking takes place. But first, we must understand that medieval torture was as much psychological as physical, a carefully orchestrated theater designed to break the will before breaking the body. The process began long before any physical contact. The accused would be brought to what was euphemistically called the chamber of examination. Here, they would be confronted with the instruments that might be used, each one explained in careful detail. The torturer, often a skilled craftsman who took pride in his precision, would describe exactly how each device worked, what pain it would cause, and how long the process might take. This psychological preparation was considered crucial. Medieval legal theory held that a freely given confession, even under the threat of torture, was more valuable than one extracted through actual physical force. Many cases ended at this stage, with the accused choosing to confess rather than endure what they had been shown was inevitable. Brother Benedict oversees this process with the same attention to detail he brings to copying manuscripts. Every word is recorded. The accused's demeanor is noted. Their responses to each explanation are documented. This isn't random intimidation. It's a systematic approach to truth extraction that has been refined over centuries. When voluntary confession was not forthcoming, the process moved to what was called territorial torture, physical contact and restraint without actual pain. The accused might be stripped and bound to a table, stretched on a rack without tension, or placed in stocks without weight. The goal was to create the conditions for torture without actually applying it, hoping that the psychological pressure would complete what the demonstration had begun. Medieval torturers were skilled professionals, often trained for years in the precise application of pain. They understood human anatomy, knew exactly how much pressure a joint could bear before breaking, could calculate how long a person could hang by their arms before losing consciousness. This wasn't sadistic brutality. It was technical expertise applied to the problem of truth extraction. The actual techniques varied widely across different regions and time periods, but all shared certain characteristics. They were designed to be reversible, leaving the subject alive and capable of normal function after confession. They focused on joints and extremities rather than vital organs. They could be applied gradually, allowing for confession at any point in the process. One of the most common techniques was the strappado, where the accused's hands were tied behind their back and they were lifted by the rope. Weights might be added to increase the stress on shoulders and arms. The process could be stopped and started multiple times, with opportunities for confession at each pause. Records show that most people subjected to this treatment confessed within the first few minutes. Brother Benedict's records reveal another crucial aspect of medieval torture. It was considered most effective when applied to people who had something to lose. Peasants and commoners, accustomed to physical hardship, often endured significant pain before confessing. But merchants, clergy, and nobility, unaccustomed to physical suffering, frequently confessed at the mere sight of the instruments. The water torture was another carefully calibrated technique. The accused would be strapped to an inclined board with a cloth placed over their face. Water would be poured slowly over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning without actual asphyxiation. The psychological effect was devastating. The brain's panic response to suffocation would trigger long before any real physical damage occurred. What made medieval torture particularly effective wasn't just the physical pain, but the complete loss of control it represented. In a world where personal dignity and social status were everything, the humiliation of being stripped, bound, and subjected to the will of social inferiors was often more devastating than the physical discomfort itself. Brother Benedict's careful documentation reveals that the process was often cyclical. Initial resistance would be met with escalating pressure until confession was obtained. But the confession itself was just the beginning. The accused would then be required to provide details that could be verified, to name accomplices, to explain methods and motivations. Inconsistencies in these details would result in renewed application of pressure until a complete and coherent narrative emerged. The medieval understanding of truth was fundamentally different from ours. They believed that truth existed independently of human perception, and that it could be discovered through the proper application of pressure. In their worldview, an innocent person touched by divine grace would either be strengthened to endure the suffering or would be miraculously delivered from it. Confession under torture wasn't seen as unreliable. It was seen as proof of guilt that had been hidden by human weakness and revealed by divine intervention. The role of confession in medieval Christianity added another layer to the process. The Church taught that confession was necessary for salvation, that hiding sin corrupted the soul, and that forcing confession was therefore an act of mercy that saved the accused from eternal damnation. The torturer wasn't destroying the victim. He was freeing them from the burden of hidden guilt. Brother Benedict truly believed he was serving both earthly and divine justice. In his carefully maintained records, we can see the genuine conviction that these procedures were necessary for the protection of Christian society. The alternative, allowing heretics, witches, and criminals to operate in secret, was seen as far more dangerous than the temporary suffering inflicted to expose them. As Brother Benedict completes his morning documentation, we must now examine the uncomfortable truth about who really benefited from medieval torture systems. For while the official justification was the pursuit of divine truth, the practical effects were far more earthly and strategic. The most immediate beneficiaries were those in power, kings, nobles, and church authorities who used torture as a tool of social control. In a world where communication was slow and armies were expensive, fear was often the most effective way to maintain order across vast territories. The knowledge that questioning authority could result in systematic torture kept potential rebels, heretics, and dissidents in line far more effectively than any standing army. Let us follow the case of Margaret the Weaver, brought before Brother Benedict's court in 1255 on charges of heresy. Margaret had been overheard questioning certain church teachings, specifically the doctrine of transubstantiation. In our modern understanding, this might seem like a minor theological dispute, but in medieval terms, it represented a fundamental challenge to the entire social order. Margaret's case, reveals how torture served multiple power structures simultaneously. The Church benefited by demonstrating that theological dissent would not be tolerated. The Crown benefited by showing that anyone who questioned one authority might question any authority. Local nobles benefited by demonstrating their loyalty to both Crown and Church. And the process itself generated wealth, confiscated property from convicted heretics, enriched all levels of the system. Brother Benedict's records show that Margaret initially maintained her innocence, claiming her words had been misunderstood. But after being shown the instruments of examination, after being explained the theological necessity of orthodox belief, after being stripped and bound to demonstrate the seriousness of her situation, she not only confessed to heresy, but provided names of others who had expressed similar doubts. This multiplication effect was crucial to the system's effectiveness. One arrest could generate dozens of new cases. One confession could uncover entire networks of dissent. The threat of torture encouraged people to report suspicious behavior in their neighbors, creating a web of surveillance that extended the reach of authority into every home and workshop. The economic benefits of torture-based justice were substantial. Convicted criminals forfeited their property to the Crown. Heretics lost their possessions to the Church. The families of the condemned often paid substantial bribes to secure less painful forms of execution. The system generated revenue at every level, creating powerful financial incentives to maintain and expand its use. Brother Benedict's position itself demonstrates this economic dimension. His salary comes from the fees charged for conducting examinations. His abbey receives a portion of all confiscated property. His scribal work documenting confessions provides income for his religious community. The entire apparatus of medieval justice was economically self-sustaining, creating stakeholders who had material reasons to believe in its effectiveness. The psychological benefits to those in power were equally important. Torture provided a sense of omniscience, the feeling that no secret could be hidden, no conspiracy could succeed, no challenge could go undetected. It created the impression that authority figures possessed supernatural powers of discovery, reinforcing their claims to divine sanction. For the broader population, torture served as a form of social bonding through shared trauma. Public executions, often preceded by torture, were community events that reinforced group identity by designating clear enemies. The ritual of collective witnessing created emotional bonds between observers and authority figures, making resistance feel like betrayal of the community itself. Brother Benedict understands intuitively what modern social scientists have proven empirically, that systems of authorized violence create psychological dependencies in both perpetrators and witnesses. The guards, torturers, and officials who implement the system develop professional pride in their expertise. The observers develop emotional investment in justifying what they've witnessed. The victims themselves often internalize the authority of their oppressors. The case of Margaret the Weaver illustrates another crucial function of medieval torture, the creation of narrative consistency. Under prolonged pressure, people didn't just confess to specific acts, they confessed to entire worldviews that justified their punishment. Margaret didn't just admit to questioning transubstantiation. She confessed to a complete theology of doubt that painted her as a fundamental threat to Christian society. These forced narratives served multiple purposes. They provided ideological justification for harsh treatment. They created precedents for future cases. They generated propaganda that reinforced official doctrine. Most importantly, they transformed individual acts of resistance into proof of large-scale conspiracies that required systematic suppression. Brother Benedict's records reveal how torture created its own evidence. People under extreme duress would confess to anything, often incorporating details from previous cases they had witnessed or heard described. These confessions would then be used as evidence in subsequent cases, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of apparent guilt and necessary punishment. The international dimension of medieval torture was equally significant. Different kingdoms and church authorities shared techniques, compared results, and adopted successful innovations. What began as local practices became standardized procedures that crossed national boundaries. The system created a shared culture of authorized violence that unified European elites across political divisions. Perhaps most disturbingly, torture served as a form of research and development for techniques of social control. The careful documentation that Brother Benedict maintains wasn't just administrative record-keeping, it was systematic study of human breaking points, psychological vulnerabilities, and effective methods of behavior modification. Knowledge gained in torture chambers was applied to broader systems of governance and social organization. As Brother Benedict ages in his service to what he believes is divine justice, subtle changes begin to appear in the world around him. By 1280, new ideas are stirring in the universities, new legal principles are being debated in scholarly circles, and new questions are being raised about the reliability of confessions obtained through torture. The first cracks in the system came not from moral revulsion, but from practical problems. Legal scholars began to notice that torture produced remarkably similar confessions regardless of the specific circumstances of each case. People under extreme duress would agree to almost any narrative suggested to them, often incorporating details from completely unrelated cases they had heard described during their own examination. Brother Benedict, now in his 50s and having documented hundreds of cases, begins to notice these patterns in his own records. The confessions of accused witches contain remarkably similar details about sabbats, demons, and rituals, details that seem to spread from one case to another rather than emerging independently from different sources. The theological explanations of heretics begin to sound suspiciously like repetitions of questions asked during examination rather than original thoughts. The rise of universities and scholarly debate created new pressure on torture-based justice systems. Academic theologians began to question whether pain necessarily revealed truth or whether it might simply force people to say whatever they thought their tormentors wanted to hear. Legal scholars trained in Roman law began to examine the logical foundations of torture-based evidence and found them increasingly unsatisfying. The economic costs of torture systems also began to outweigh their benefits in many contexts. Maintaining professional torturers, specialized equipment, and elaborate documentation systems was expensive. The loss of productive citizens through execution or exile damaged local economies. The climate of fear that torture created often discouraged trade, innovation, and economic development. Brother Benedict witnesses the emergence of new legal procedures that place greater emphasis on witness testimony, documentary evidence, and logical analysis. These methods produce results more quickly and cheaply than torture, while generating fewer appeals and complications. Practical administrators begin to favor efficiency over theatrical demonstrations of power. The Protestant Reformation accelerated these changes by challenging the authority structures that torture systems were designed to protect. When religious unity could no longer be assumed, when political legitimacy became contestable, when social hierarchies were openly questioned, the theological justifications for torture began to seem less compelling. New philosophical ideas about human nature also undermined torture-based justice. The growing influence of Aristotelian logic emphasized careful reasoning over revelation through suffering. Humanist scholars began to argue that human dignity required certain minimum protections even for the guilty. The concept of natural rights slowly gained ground among educated elites. Brother Benedict's own faith begins to evolve as he ages. Personal experience with the torture system, seeing how often it produced false confessions, how readily it could be manipulated by ambitious prosecutors, how frequently it targeted the vulnerable rather than the genuinely dangerous, gradually erodes his confidence in its divine sanction. The international political changes of the late medieval period also contributed to torture's decline. The rise of stronger centralized states reduced the need for local demonstrations of power. Professional armies and improved communication systems provided more effective tools for maintaining order. The growth of commerce created stakeholder groups who valued predictable legal systems over arbitrary enforcement. Scientific developments, though still primitive by modern standards, began to offer alternative methods for investigating crimes and testing claims. The careful observation of natural phenomena that characterized early scientific thinking suggested new approaches to examining human testimony and evaluating evidence. The case that finally shakes Brother Benedict's faith in the system involves a young mother accused of infanticide. Under torture, she confesses not only to killing her own child, but to participating in elaborate satanic rituals that clearly never occurred. When the child is later found alive in a neighboring village, the entire foundation of torture-based truth-seeking crumbles for Benedict personally. This experience, repeated thousands of times across Europe, as torture systems produced increasingly obvious false confessions, gradually undermined public confidence in the method. Legal scholars began developing new standards for evidence that emphasized consistency, corroboration, and logical coherence rather than dramatic revelation through suffering. The emergence of printed books accelerated the spread of new ideas about justice and human rights. Scholars could now easily compare legal systems across different regions and time periods. The obvious failures and inconsistencies of torture-based justice became more apparent when documented and distributed widely. Economic changes also reduced the effectiveness of torture as a tool of social control. The growth of merchant classes created new centers of power that didn't depend on traditional feudal relationships. Cities became more complex and diverse, making simple unity through shared enemies more difficult to maintain. The need for skilled workers made the casual destruction of human resources through torture economically wasteful. Brother Benedict, now retired from active legal work, but still maintaining historical records, begins to document not just individual cases, but patterns across decades of experience. His private writings, never intended for publication, reveal a gradual recognition that the system he spent his life serving was fundamentally flawed in its basic assumptions about human nature and divine justice. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries provided a final demonstration of torture's limitations. When different Christian groups used identical methods to extract contradictory confessions from each other, the claim that torture revealed divine truth became impossible to sustain. The method that was supposed to protect religious unity instead became evidence of its impossibility. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries provided a final demonstration of torture's limitations. When different Christian groups used identical methods to extract contradictory confessions from each other, the claim that torture revealed divine truth became impossible to sustain. The method that was supposed to protect religious unity instead became evidence of its impossibility. By the time Brother Benedict writes his final entries in 1290, he has witnessed the beginning of changes that will eventually transform European justice systems entirely. Though he cannot foresee the full scope of what is coming, his careful documentation has preserved for us a window into both the systematic nature of medieval torture and the human capacity to recognize and ultimately reject even deeply entrenched systems of cruelty. As Brother Benedict's career draws toward its end, a new and more systematic form of authorized violence emerges across Europe: the Papal Inquisition. This development represents the ultimate refinement of torture-based justice, combining all the techniques and justifications that Benedict has spent his lifetime documenting into a single, unified system of ideological control. The Inquisition, established formally by Pope Gregory IX in 1231, represents something qualitatively different from the local and regional torture systems that Benedict has served. This is torture as state policy, systematic persecution as religious duty, and bureaucratized cruelty as the foundation of social order. For the first time in European history, torture becomes not just a tool of justice, but the organizing principle of an entire institutional apparatus. Brother Benedict, now serving as an advisor to the newly established inquisitorial tribunal in southern France, witnesses the transformation of everything he thought he understood about the relationship between truth, power, and suffering. The Inquisition doesn't just use torture to extract confessions, it uses the threat of torture to reshape entire populations' understanding of acceptable thought and behavior. Let us follow the case of Master Guillaume, a university-trained physician who has fallen under suspicion for his interest in Arabic medical texts. In the earlier period of Benedict's career, such a case might have involved questioning the physician about specific heretical statements or actions. But under the inquisitorial system, Guillaume's guilt is assumed from the moment of accusation. The question is not whether he is guilty, but what exactly he is guilty of, and who else shares his guilt. The inquisitorial process begins with what is called charitable warning. Guillaume is informed that he has been denounced for heretical activities and is given the opportunity to confess voluntarily. But this apparent mercy conceals a sophisticated psychological trap. The authorities already possess detailed information about Guillaume's activities, obtained through a network of informants and previous confessions. His denial of obvious facts will be taken as evidence of impenitence, justifying harsher treatment. Brother Benedict documents each stage of Guillaume's case with the same methodical care he has always applied, but now he is part of a much larger apparatus. Guillaume's confession will be compared with standard templates developed by inquisitorial theorists. His statements will be analyzed for theological precision by teams of trained specialists. His physical responses to questioning will be evaluated according to detailed manuals that describe the expected behavior of different types of heretics. The Inquisition's innovation lies not in its cruelty, but in its systematic nature. Every aspect of the torture process has been studied, refined, and standardized. The timing of questions, the sequence of physical pressures, the psychological preparation of subjects, the interpretation of responses, all have been reduced to teachable techniques that can be applied consistently across different cases and different regions. Guillaume's examination takes place over a period of weeks, with careful attention to maintaining his physical condition between sessions. The inquisitors understand that a subject who dies under torture cannot provide the detailed confessions and additional names that make the system effective. They have developed sophisticated methods for inflicting maximum psychological pressure while minimizing permanent physical damage. The documentation requirements of the Inquisition far exceed anything Brother Benedict has previously encountered. Every word spoken during examination is recorded by multiple scribes. Every physical procedure is described in detail. Every response is analyzed for theological significance. The resulting records create a vast archive of human suffering that serves multiple purposes: legal precedent, training material, and propaganda for the system's effectiveness. Brother Benedict begins to understand that the Inquisition's true purpose extends far beyond the punishment of individual heretics. The systematic terror it creates serves to atomize communities, destroying the social bonds that might support resistance to authority. When anyone might be an informant, when any unusual statement might result in denunciation, when any friendship might become evidence of conspiracy, normal social life becomes impossible. The economic dimensions of inquisitorial torture also surpass anything from the earlier period. The confiscation of property from condemned heretics provides massive funding for the system's expansion. Wealthy individuals become particular targets, not because they are necessarily more heretical, but because their destruction generates the resources needed to pursue additional cases. The system becomes self-funding and therefore self-perpetuating. Guillaume's case illustrates another crucial innovation of the inquisitorial system, the concept of negative confession. Even if Guillaume successfully resists torture and maintains his innocence, his refusal to confess can be interpreted as evidence of demonic assistance or supernatural heretical powers. The system is designed to be unfalsifiable. Every possible response confirms the guilt of the accused. The Inquisition's psychological sophistication also extends to its treatment of witnesses and informants. People who provide denunciations are promised spiritual benefits and material rewards. Those who fail to report suspicious behavior are themselves subject to punishment. The system creates powerful incentives for preemptive betrayal, as the safest position for any individual is to denounce others before being denounced themselves. Brother Benedict's role in this system forces him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own moral responsibility. He has spent decades serving what he believed was divine justice, but the Inquisition's obvious political motivations and economic incentives make such justifications increasingly difficult to maintain. His private writings from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his faith with his growing understanding of the system's true nature. The Inquisition's international character also represents something new in European history. Techniques developed in one region are quickly transmitted to others. Successful innovations in torture and interrogation spread rapidly across the network of inquisitorial tribunals. The system creates a shared culture of authorized violence that transcends national boundaries and local traditions. The case of Guillaume reaches its inevitable conclusion when he finally confesses to a comprehensive program of heretical activities that clearly never occurred. Under prolonged pressure, he has internalized the Inquisitor's theological framework and now describes his own thoughts and actions using their categories and assumptions. His confession serves not just as an admission of guilt, but as a validation of the entire worldview that justifies his persecution. Brother Benedict's documentation of Guillaume's case reveals the Inquisition's most disturbing achievement, the creation of a system so totalizing that it transforms its victims into collaborators. Guillaume doesn't just confess to heretical activities. He expresses gratitude for the process that has revealed his spiritual corruption and provided the opportunity for redemption through suffering. The Inquisition's success in creating such psychological transformation becomes a model for later systems of ideological control. The techniques developed in 13th century torture chambers, isolation, disorientation, systematic humiliation, the gradual reconstruction of identity according to authorities' requirements, will be refined and applied in contexts that Brother Benedict cannot imagine. As Guillaume's case concludes with his public execution, Brother Benedict realizes that he has witnessed the emergence of something qualitatively different from traditional medieval justice. The Inquisition represents the systematic application of torture not just to individual cases, but to the broader project of social control. It is no longer enough to punish specific crimes. The goal now is to prevent the very possibility of unauthorized thought. In the winter of 1291, Brother Benedict faces a case that will shatter his remaining faith in the system he has served for nearly 4 decades. The accused is Sister Marguerite, a young nun from the local convent who has been denounced for expressing doubts about certain church teachings during private conversations with other sisters. Sister Marguerite represents everything that the torture system claims to protect. She is devout, learned, genuinely committed to Christian life, and respected by her community. Her alleged heretical statements amount to nothing more than theological questions of the sort that have been debated by church scholars for centuries. In an earlier era, such concerns might have been addressed through spiritual guidance and scholarly discussion. But under the inquisitorial system, theological questioning has become indistinguishable from heretical rebellion. Sister Marguerite's intellectual curiosity, her desire to understand rather than simply accept doctrine, marks her as a dangerous threat to institutional authority. The very qualities that would have made her a valued member of the religious community now make her a target for systematic persecution. Brother Benedict knows Sister Marguerite personally. She has assisted him with manuscript copying and has demonstrated both exceptional skill and genuine piety in her work. Her case forces him to confront the possibility that the system he has served so faithfully might be fundamentally corrupted, that the pursuit of truth through torture might actually be the pursuit of power through terror. The examination of Sister Margaret follows the standard inquisitorial procedures that Benedict has helped to refine over decades of practice. She is shown the instruments of torture and given detailed explanations of their use. She is stripped and bound to demonstrate her complete vulnerability to institutional power. She is subjected to progressive physical pressure designed to break her will while preserving her life. But Sister Marguerite's responses differ from those of previous subjects in ways that deeply disturb Brother Benedict. Her theological sophistication allows her to engage with her interrogators' questions at a level that exposes the intellectual poverty of their position. Her genuine faith provides her with resources for resistance that purely secular subjects lack. Her obvious innocence makes the brutality of her treatment impossible to justify through normal inquisitorial reasoning. As Brother Benedict documents Sister Marguerite's examination, he begins to see the process through her eyes rather than through the lens of institutional necessity. The careful procedures that he has always viewed as evidence of the system's justice now appear as elaborate rituals designed to legitimize predetermined outcomes. The theological sophistication that he has admired in inquisitorial reasoning now seems like intellectual camouflage for simple brutality. Sister Marguerite's resistance to torture forces Benedict to confront questions he has spent his career avoiding. If an obviously innocent and devout person can be subjected to systematic torture for asking legitimate theological questions, what does this say about the system's claim to serve divine justice? If the process is designed to produce confessions regardless of actual guilt or innocence, what truth is it really revealing? The progression of Sister Margaret's case follows the familiar pattern: initial resistance, gradual weakening under physical and psychological pressure, eventual confession to activities that clearly never occurred. But Benedict's documentation of this process now reads like an indictment rather than a justification. Every stage of the procedure that once seemed necessary now appears gratuitously cruel. Soft weeping in the distance, gradually fading. Sister Marguerite's final confession includes detailed descriptions of heretical activities, supernatural encounters, and conspiracies that Benedict knows to be impossible. She names other nuns as co-conspirators, provides accounts of secret meetings that never occurred, and describes theological positions that she clearly does not hold. Her statement serves all the system's requirements while being obviously false in every particular. The completion of Sister Margaret's case marks a turning point in Brother Benedict's understanding of his own moral position. He can no longer maintain the fiction that torture reveals truth when he has personally witnessed it create elaborate falsehoods. He can no longer believe that the system serves divine justice when he has seen it destroy the genuinely devout. He can no longer justify his participation by appealing to institutional necessity when the institution's goals have become obviously corrupted. Brother Benedict's private writings from this period reveal a man undergoing profound spiritual crisis. The theological framework that has supported his entire adult life begins to collapse under the weight of accumulated contradictions. The institutional loyalties that have defined his identity become sources of shame rather than pride. The intellectual traditions that he has served so faithfully now appear as elaborate justifications for systematic cruelty. The aftermath of Sister Marguerite's execution, she is burned as an unrepentant heretic despite her obvious innocence, forces Benedict to make fundamental choices about his own future. He can continue serving a system that he now recognizes as fundamentally corrupted, or he can risk his own position by challenging institutional authority. Benedict's solution is characteristically intellectual. He begins to document not just individual cases, but the systemic patterns that reveal the torture apparatus's true nature. His later writings, never intended for publication, provide devastating analysis of the gap between the system's stated goals and its actual effects. These documents, preserved in monastery archives, would later provide crucial evidence for scholars studying the historical development of authorized violence. The psychological toll of this revelation transforms Brother Benedict from a confident servant of institutional authority into a haunted observer of systematic cruelty. His later years are marked by increasing isolation, growing skepticism about claims of absolute truth, and deep regret about his own complicity in activities that he now recognizes as fundamentally evil. Music becomes softer, more reflective. Sister Marguerite's case also provides Benedict with insight into the personal costs of serving systems of authorized violence. He realizes that his own moral sensitivity has been gradually eroded through decades of witnessing and documenting human suffering. The professional detachment that once seemed like necessary expertise now appears as a form of spiritual death. The community's response to Sister Marguerite's execution also reveals the broader social dynamics that sustain systems of torture. Despite widespread private doubts about her guilt, public criticism of the proceedings is virtually non-existent. The combination of fear, institutional loyalty, and psychological investment in justifying witnessed suffering creates a conspiracy of silence that protects the system from serious challenge. Brother Benedict's final entries regarding Sister Marguerite's case read like a confession of his own guilt. He acknowledges his role in refining procedures that made her suffering more systematic. He recognizes his intellectual contributions to theological frameworks that legitimized her persecution. He accepts responsibility for his failure to challenge a system that he should have recognized as corrupted much earlier. The questions raised by Sister Marguerite's case continue to haunt Brother Benedict for the remainder of his life. How do good people become complicit in systematic evil? How do intellectual frameworks evolve to justify obvious cruelty? How do institutional loyalties override moral obligations? These concerns, documented in his private writings, provide insight into the psychological dynamics that enable systems of authorized violence to persist across historical periods. As Brother Benedict enters the final years of his life, spending his days in quiet contemplation rather than active service to the tribunal, he begins to see his lifetime's work as part of a much larger historical pattern. The systematic torture that he helped to refine and document was not an aberration of medieval Christianity, but an early example of the human capacity to bureaucratize cruelty and legitimate suffering through intellectual sophistication. In his final writings, composed in the monastery scriptorium where he first learned to serve what he believed was divine truth, Benedict reflects on the persistence of the forces that created medieval torture systems. He recognizes that the psychological mechanisms that made torture effective, the combination of fear, authority, and social pressure, represent permanent aspects of human social organization rather than temporary historical anomalies. The bureaucratic procedures that Benedict documented so meticulously have provided templates for later systems of authorized violence that extend far beyond medieval Europe. The careful documentation, the systematic progression of pressure, the intellectual frameworks that transform cruelty into necessity, these innovations have proven remarkably durable and adaptable to different historical contexts. Benedict's analysis of torture's psychological effects anticipated discoveries that would not be formally recognized until centuries later. His observations about the unreliability of confessions obtained under duress, the tendency of torture to produce false narratives that confirm interrogators' preconceptions, and the corruption of moral judgment that occurs in those who implement systems of authorized violence, all would be validated by modern psychological research. The economic dimensions of medieval torture that Benedict documented also provided precedents for later systems that generate revenue through the systematic persecution of vulnerable populations. The confiscation of property from condemned heretics, the creation of professional classes whose livelihood depends on maintaining persecution, the use of fear to control larger populations while extracting resources from specific targets. These patterns recur throughout subsequent history. Brother Benedict's documentation of the Inquisition's international character also anticipated the global spread of systematic torture techniques in later periods. The networks of communication that allowed innovations in cruelty to spread rapidly across Europe provided models for the international diffusion of repressive technologies and techniques that characterizes more recent historical periods. Sounds gradually transitioning to gentle rain, peaceful night ambience. Perhaps most importantly, Benedict's detailed records of how good people become complicit in systematic evil provide insight into moral choices that face every generation. His own trajectory from enthusiastic servant of what he believed was divine justice to haunted witness of systematic cruelty illustrates the gradual process by which institutional loyalties can override moral obligations. The theological frameworks that Benedict helped to develop, the distinction between those deserving of protection and those subject to extraordinary measures, the belief that hidden truth can be revealed through systematic pressure, the assumption that resistance to authority indicates guilt, continue to influence modern systems of control in forms that would be recognizable to 13th century minds. Benedict's careful documentation of torture's effects on both victims and perpetrators also provides evidence for understanding the long-term social consequences of authorized violence. The trauma experienced by direct victims, the moral corruption of those who implement systems of cruelty, the broader social effects of fear and mistrust, all represent costs that extend far beyond immediate physical suffering. The legal precedents established during the medieval period that Benedict served also provided foundations for modern exceptions to normal rights and protections. The concept of extraordinary circumstances that justify suspension of ordinary legal safeguards, the use of specialized courts with reduced evidentiary standards, the creation of categories of people subject to different legal treatment, all trace their origins to innovations of the medieval period. Modern interrogation techniques often rely on psychological principles that medieval torturers, like those Benedict served, understood intuitively. The isolation of suspects, the manipulation of hope and fear, the gradual escalation of pressure, the use of disorientation and dependency. These methods produce confessions through mental rather than physical coercion, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar to those Benedict documented. The surveillance and documentation systems that characterize modern states also find their historical precedence in the records that Benedict maintained so carefully. The medieval desire to penetrate all secrets and expose all hidden thoughts has been realized through digital technology that would seem miraculous to 13th century minds, but serves functions that Benedict would readily recognize. The social dynamics that made medieval torture a community event, the collective witnessing of authorized violence, the psychological bonding through shared experience of others' suffering, the reinforcement of group identity through designation of enemies, continue to operate in modern contexts through media, political ritual, and cultural practice. Brother Benedict's legacy challenges us to examine our own certainties, our own methods of determining truth, our own systems for distinguishing between the deserving and undeserving. His transformation from confident servant of institutional authority to skeptical witness of systematic cruelty provides a model for the kind of moral growth that remains necessary in every historical period. As we prepare to leave Brother Benedict's world and return to our own time, we carry with us the uncomfortable recognition that the forces that created medieval torture systems continue to operate in forms that may be less obvious, but are no less real. The fundamental questions that medieval torture was designed to answer: how do we distinguish truth from deception, guilt from innocence, safety from danger, remain as challenging today as they were in Benedict's time. The hidden truth about medieval torture is not simply that it was a historical aberration that we've fortunately left behind, but that it reveals persistent aspects of human nature that require constant vigilance and conscious resistance. The capacity for systematic cruelty, the ability to develop intellectual justifications for obvious evil, the tendency to sacrifice individual dignity for collective security. These represent permanent temptations that each generation must recognize and reject anew. Brother Benedict's careful records, preserved in monastery archives and rediscovered by modern historians, remind us that the most systematic cruelties are often perpetrated by people who genuinely believe they are serving the highest moral principles. His documentation of how torture systems develop, operate, and eventually collapse provides essential knowledge for recognizing and resisting similar developments in our own time. In understanding how a learned and devout man like Brother Benedict became complicit in systematic cruelty, and how he eventually recognized and rejected his complicity, we gain insight into the moral choices that face every individual who lives under systems of authorized violence. His example suggests both the dangers of uncritical institutional loyalty and the possibility of moral growth, even under the most compromising circumstances. As we close Brother Benedict's chronicles and prepare to drift back into peaceful sleep, we carry with us not the weight of despair, but the quiet wisdom that comes from understanding the full complexity of human moral experience. His story reminds us that even in history's darkest chapters, individuals retained the capacity for growth, recognition, and ultimately rejection of systematic evil. The medieval world that produced both the cruelties we have explored and the man who came to document and reject them was not fundamentally different from our own. The same human capacities for both good and evil, the same institutional dynamics that can either protect or threaten human dignity, the same moral choices between expedient compliance and difficult resistance, all remain as relevant today as they were 7 centuries ago. Brother Benedict's final years, spent in quiet contemplation and careful historical documentation, rather than active service to systems of authorized violence, suggest a path toward redemption that remains available to every generation. His transformation from enthusiastic participant to critical observer to historical witness provides a model for the kind of moral evolution that societies as well as individuals can achieve. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the questions raised by this exploration of medieval justice remain relevant to our own time, but also knowing that each new day brings opportunities to choose compassion over control, understanding over certainty, and human dignity over systemic efficiency. Brother Benedict's legacy lives not in the systems he initially served, but in his eventual recognition of their fundamental corruption and his commitment to documenting both their operations and their ultimate failure. Tomorrow's light will illuminate new possibilities for justice, mercy, and human flourishing that medieval minds could barely imagine. We honor both Brother Benedict and his victims by maintaining vigilance against the human tendency to sacrifice individual dignity for collective security, to mistake power for truth, and to confuse our own fears with divine mandate. And if this journey through history's shadows has brought you understanding, wisdom, or even simply the peace that comes from confronting difficult truths with courage and compassion, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe for more thoughtful explorations of the past. Next week, we'll discover the remarkable lives of medieval alchemists, those curious scholars who stood at the intersection between ancient magic and emerging science, seeking to transform not just base metals into gold, but human understanding itself. Until then, rest well under stars that have witnessed humanity's capacity for both systematic cruelty and profound redemption. Remember that every generation inherits the moral legacy of those who came before, but also possesses the power to choose which aspects of that legacy they will preserve, which they will transform, and which they will have the courage to leave behind. Sweet dreams, gentle travelers through time. May your rest be peaceful and your awakening filled with renewed commitment to the kind of justice that serves human dignity rather than institutional power. Good night.